Margaret Chen had been caring for elderly patients for 23 years, but there was something about Mr. Walter Bennett that touched her heart differently. Perhaps it was the way his weathered hands trembled when he tried to button his cardigan, or how his blue eyes would light up whenever she entered his room at Maplewood Care Home, even on his cloudiest days. Walter was 87, a widower of 12 years. His wife Eleanor had been his whole world, and since her passing he'd grown quieter, retreating into memories that Margaret could only glimpse through the faded photographs on his bedside table. A young couple dancing, a family at the beach, birthday cakes and Christmas mornings frozen in time. Margaret was 54 herself, with silver threading through her dark hair that she pulled back into a practical ponytail each morning. She'd raised 2 daughters on her own, after her husband left when the girls were small. Caregiving wasn't just her profession, it had become her calling, her way of giving to others what she'd once needed herself. Patient, unwavering kindness. On this particular autumn afternoon, golden light filtered through Walter's window, casting warm shadows across the room. He'd had a difficult morning, confused and agitated, calling out for Eleanor. The medication had finally calmed him, but Margaret could see the sadness settle deep in his eyes as he sat in his wheelchair, staring at nothing in particular. She pulled up a chair beside him and took his hand gently. His skin was paper-thin, marked with age spots and the history of a long life. "How are you feeling now, Walter?" she asked softly. He turned to her slowly, recognition flickering across his face. "Tired," he whispered. "So tired, Margaret." "I know," she said, patting his hand. "Would you like me to sing to you? Sometimes music helps." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Margaret began to hum, then sang softly, an old melody her grandmother had sung to her as a child. "You are my sunshine." Simple words, but filled with comfort. Her voice was gentle, worn smooth by time like river stones, carrying notes that spoke of patience and care. As she sang, Walter's shoulders relaxed. His eyes closed, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Margaret continued verse after verse, her thumb moving gently across the back of his hand, in time with the melody. What she didn't know was that someone stood in the doorway, watching. Daniel Bennett had flown in from Seattle that morning. At 49, he'd built a software empire from his garage, turning late nights and coffee-fueled coding sessions into a company worth hundreds of millions. Success had come at a price: missed birthdays, holidays spent working, years of distance from his father. His last visit had been 8 months ago, a rushed weekend filled with guilt and awkward silences. Now, leaning against the doorframe of his father's room, Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest. He watched this nurse, Margaret, according to her name tag, sing to his father with such tenderness, such genuine care that tears began to blur his vision. She wasn't just doing a job. She was giving his father something Daniel had failed to provide: simple, present, human warmth. When the song ended, Margaret sat in comfortable silence with Walter, still holding his hand. She didn't reach for her phone or check the time. She simply stayed present, as if there was nowhere else in the world she needed to be. Daniel cleared his throat softly. Margaret turned, startled, her hand instinctively protective on Walter's arm. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, stepping into the room. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Daniel, Walter's son." Recognition and something like concern flashed across Margaret's face. She'd seen the notes in Walter's chart. Son lives out of state. Visits infrequent. She stood, smoothing her scrubs. "Mr. Bennett, it's good to meet you. I'm Margaret Chen, your father's primary caregiver on this shift." Daniel extended his hand, and when Margaret shook it, he held on just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you were doing just now, that was beautiful." Margaret's cheeks colored slightly. "Your father responds well to music. It helps him remember, helps him feel less alone." The words landed like stones in Daniel's heart. Less alone. How many days had his father sat in this room, feeling alone, while Daniel sat in board meetings 3,000 miles away? Over the next hour, as Margaret went about her duties, adjusting Walter's pillows, bringing him water, speaking to him with consistent gentleness, Daniel watched and learned. He saw how she anticipated his father's needs before Walter could articulate them, how she maintained his dignity, never speaking down to him or rushing through tasks. How she made his father laugh with a gentle joke about the terrible hospital coffee. This was more than professional care. This was love in action. That evening, after Walter had fallen asleep, Daniel found Margaret in the staff break room, warming up leftovers in the microwave. "May I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. Margaret nodded, tired but attentive. Her shift had started at 6 that morning. They sat across from each other at the small table, paper cups of coffee between them. Daniel didn't know quite how to begin. "I've been a terrible son," he said finally. "I've let my work, my life, my excuses keep me away. And you've been here, caring for him when I should have been." Margaret shook her head gently. "You're here now. That's what matters." "How long have you been caring for him?" "About 9 months. Since he moved to Maplewood." 9 months. Daniel had visited twice. Twice. "Tell me about him," Daniel said. "Tell me what his days are like. What makes him happy. What he talks about." And Margaret did. She told him how Walter loved the morning sunshine, how he still remembered every detail about Eleanor, how he worried about being a burden, how he cherished the little things, a good cup of tea, the birds at the feeder outside his window, visits from the facility's therapy dog. She spoke about Walter's dignity, his kindness to the other residents, his quiet courage in facing each difficult day. "He talks about you sometimes," Margaret said gently. "He's very proud of you. He has the articles from business magazines on his bulletin board. He tells anyone who will listen about his brilliant son." Daniel put his face in his hands. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," Margaret said, her honesty kind rather than harsh. "But love isn't about deserving. It's about showing up, and you're here now." That conversation changed everything. Daniel extended his trip. Then he began making changes to his company structure, delegating more, creating systems that didn't require his constant presence. Over the following months, he visited every 2 weeks, then every week. He arranged his schedule around his father, not the other way around. But he did something else, too. He'd learned that Margaret was working double shifts regularly, trying to save money for her daughter's wedding and help. Her other daughter with college tuition for her grandchildren. She'd never complained, never asked for anything, but the exhaustion showed in the lines around her eyes. 6 months after that first encounter, Daniel arrived at Maplewood with documents in hand. He found Margaret in the garden with his father, reading to him from the newspaper. "Margaret, can we talk?" She looked up concerned. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right," Daniel said. "I have a proposal for you." He explained that he'd established a family foundation and wanted Margaret to direct its caregiving, initiative, training, other caregivers in the kind of compassionate, dignified care she provided naturally. The salary was triple what she earned now, with full benefits and reasonable hours. "You've shown me what true caregiving looks like," Daniel said. "You gave my father something I couldn't, your time, your presence, your heart. You gave him dignity and joy in his final years. That's invaluable. Let me help you share that with others." Margaret sat stunned, tears streaming down her face. Walter reached over and patted her hand, his smile knowing and pleased. "You deserve this," Walter whispered. "You deserve every good thing." Margaret accepted, not for the money, but for the chance to teach others what she'd learned through decades of caring, that every person, regardless of age or condition, deserves to be seen, valued, and loved. The foundation flourished. Margaret trained hundreds of caregivers, teaching them to see past tasks and charts to the whole human being before them, to sing when words fail, to hold hands and sit in silence, to bring sunshine into rooms that had known too much shadow. Walter lived another year, his final months filled with his son's presence and Margaret's continued friendship. He passed peacefully one spring morning, with Daniel holding one hand and Margaret holding the other, and birdsong coming through the open window. At his memorial service, Daniel told the story of that autumn afternoon, how he'd stood in a doorway and watched a caregiver sing to his father, and how that moment of witnessed kindness had changed the course of his life. "She taught me," he said, his voice breaking, "that success isn't measured in dollars or deals. It's measured in presence, in showing up, in singing softly to someone who needs to hear that they're not alone." Margaret still thinks about Walter often. She keeps a photograph of him and Eleanor on her desk at the foundation office. Sometimes, when she's training new caregivers, She tells them about an elderly man who loved sunshine and bird watching, who missed his wife terribly, who needed someone to simply sit with him and sing. And she teaches them that small acts of kindness, a song, a held hand, patient presence can change not just one life but many, like ripples moving outward from a single stone dropped in still water. Compassion spreads, touching shores we may never see. That's the real miracle, Margaret tells them. Not the money or the foundation or the changed careers, but the moment when we choose to see another person's humanity and respond with our own. When we show up with open hearts, even when, especially when it's inconvenient or difficult or unpaid. That's when we become fully human ourselves. That's when we sing,